Hello, welcome. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use Office scripts along with Power Automation to achieve simple scheduling automation. The example I'm using is inspired by a question posted by a user on the social channel, and it is very simple. There's a recruiter who maintains a list of candidates whose interviews are coming up or needs to be scheduled. And in this spreadsheet, there is one record per the candidate, and it has candidates basic information along with two of the interviewers information along with their email and then the date, a start time and date at which the interview is supposed to happen. And the goal of the recruiter is to periodically go in and send out Teams meeting invites to both the candidates and the interviewer based on the schedule that's confirmed here. Now, to achieve this, what we will need eventually is a Power Automation flow, such as this one. And I'm going to show kind of step-by-step way to achieve this. But at the beginning, I'm going to show what we are working towards. So this is a Power Automation flow. And if you're not familiar with Power Automation, do check out their website. It is triggered manually, but you can have it triggered based on any condition such as submission of a form or arrival of an email and so on. And it has sort of three steps. It runs to begin with on the same Excel file we were looking at, an Office script, and it extracts information about both the candidates and the interviewers along with their start and end times for the next action to create a Teams meeting invite. So you'll see that there is an apply each, which means for each of the selected rows or selected candidates, it performs that action of sending or creating a team meeting once. So for each of the candidates selected, it sends a team invite. And then at the end, it marks the records back in Excel file as invitation sent. So let's go back to the spreadsheet again to look at the data. So there is this column called invite to interview, which means that we only want to select rows whose invitation has not been sent. And that's so the point of this last action is to, once the invitation have been sent, come back and mark them as sent, which is basically mark these rows where the invites need to be sent as true. That means invitation have been sent. So this is the overall flow that we're going to be working towards. To achieve this, we need two scripts. The first one that extracts the information out of the candidates rows and sends it to this action, and then finally whoever has been qualified to receive invitations for those records, we want to mark them as completed. So we need two scripts and this Power Automation flow to achieve the end-to-end scenario. So if you're kind of familiar with actions such as create a team meeting, and because we are performing for each of the candidates who've been qualified, it makes sense to send a collection of candidate records to this action, which means that we need an array of candidates. And the structure that best suits this is something that I'm going to show just in a second. So this is, think of this as an object or a JSON structure where I have a collection of objects. So each object contains like an ID, candidates, and interviewer information along with start and finish time. Now this structure, the structure that we need kind of mirrors what we have in the spreadsheet. But the key difference is that here it's sort of in a tabular form. And what we want to do is to extract this into more of an object structure where each object has sort of key value pair that represents the data that's in this spreadsheet. So if we attain this format, the action to send the meeting invite to create team meeting invite becomes much simpler, because then you can say for each record, just select candidate information, interviewers information, start end times, So it makes the creation of this structure much more simpler. Now, obviously, the data that we have in Excel, it's we need some transformation to extract this into a collection of objects. So that's where we're going to start. So we're going to start by creating the first script that extracts the candidate records and sends it to a create team meeting flow action by passing a collection of objects for each of the selected candidates. So we're going to go to the Automate tab and open the code editor. Make sure, and then I'm going to start out with a new script, and I'm going to call this meeting schedule. Now the first step I'm going to do is to take the sort of the tabular structure we have and convert that into an object array. Now, once I have an object array that extracts all of the records, I can start adding more logic, such as filtering out only the records for whom the interview needs to be sent, invitation needs to be sent, and the due dates matches, and so on. All right. So the first step is to get the reference to the sheet. So this data sits in a sheet called interviews, and I'm going to get a reference to that. And now, because we know there is only one table in this worksheet, I can also get the reference to the table, the Excel table. And so sheet exposes a function called get tables. And if you know the table ID or name, you can use the get table. But since I don't know, I'm going to just use the get tables. And I'm going to get just the first instance, which is the only instance in this case. Now that I have the table, I'm going to extract the data rows from this table. So which means from the table, the underlying, I'm going to get the underlying range. So range is an object in Excel that represents one or many collections. So when I get range of a table, it extracts all the underlying cells that are tied to this table in the form of a range object. Range object exposes get texts, and this method returns the values in the form of string. So now what data rows is just a two-dimensional string that we can now iterate over to perform transformation. So from the two-dimensional string representation of this, what we want is a collection of objects. So we want to write like a helper function that can accept the texts that are extracted from here and then return one object for each of the candidates. So in order to achieve that, I'm going to write a function. Let's call this function return object from values. So it receives values that is in the form of two-dimensional string, and then now earlier I showed sort of the intended structure that we want to create. So this has keys and values, and because the table structure can vary from one table to another table. Like for instance, if the recruiter comes and adds a few more columns, we don't want this script to be updated again. So to extract this in a dynamic fashion, we're going to assume that the keys are going to be the table row header. So that means ID, invite to interview, and so on. And the values are going to be the actual values in the cell. So to do that, I'll need a basic interface that is just represents a key value pair. And in TypeScript, you use the interface definition to create a basic key value pair objects. So this is so what this is doing is it's saying, hey, I'm gonna create an interface which can have a key value pair where the key is a string and value is string. So this is a very kind of basic shell object that can hold pretty much any objects. So the next goal is, once I want to go through each of these rows and then create an object for each of the candidate. I want to treat the header rows in a special manner because I know this contains the keys. And then once I have a reference to keys, because I know the column names, the column numbers always match for any given cell, I can easily extract that into the appropriate key value pairs. So for that, I'm going to create an output object called object array. So this is what I want to return at the end of the function. First, I want to hold on to have a reference to the keys. So I'm going to declare object keys variable, which is just a string array. Initially, it's empty. Now I want to iterate over each of the rows coming out of the table. And now I know that if the index is 0, that it will always contain the header. So I'm going to get the object keys. I'm going to save the actual header values, and then I'll skip processing that further because I don't need to process the header row any further. If it is not a header row, I want to then convert the candidate information into an object. So I'm going to create a temporary holding structure. I'll call it just object. And what I want to do now is to traverse through each of the cells or each of the column within a given row. Oops. And then extract that into an object structure, basically transform that. So I'll need a second loop within the first loop, and it is going to be for each of the columns. So that means for each of the row, which is values I want to get the length. So that represents a number of columns. And then I want to iterate over each column one at a time. And for that, once I have that, I'm going to start filling in this temporary object for one row at a time. And what I want to do is for each of the key, and that is represented by object keys. So the J represents the column. So what this means is that on any object keys of index J, it'll represent the actual header value. So for instance, if J is 4, it is going to say candidate email as the header value. So for that key, I want to extract the value, the individual value of the cell, which is the I and jth value. So in this case, let's say I'm on the 4th row, so that is going to be the actual email address, and the key is going to be the candidate email. So what this is doing is just basically collecting all the information in the form of an object. So once I extract all the objects into all the keys value pairs into a temporary object, I'm going to start pushing that into my output object. So that's going to be what I declared outside the loop. I'm going to start just pushing it, and okay. So now that I have transformed the rows into objects, I can just return the final object. So object array, so I can return that. and I'll also declare in the function signature that this is returning the basic object back. So just to see what it's returning, I can just log right before it returns. So I should see at this point 3 objects with key value pairs. So I'm going to just run this now and see what happens. Oh, first I need to call this. So, so this line basically just invoked this function and it got back these selected records in the form of objects. And if we run this, we should see 3 objects. And each of the object structure would look very much similar to that of the table structure, except that now it is in the form of key value pairs. Okay, so this is a really basic transformation. Now, once we have this, we can start applying kind of more business rules on top of this. The sort of the 2 business rules we need is we want to extract only the records for whom the invitations have not been sent. And then the second is we want to only extract for only construct those records for whom the start date and time is in the future. So we don't want to select any historical records. And then the second thing is we want to compute the meeting start and finish time. The finish time or the duration of the meeting is stored in the same spreadsheet. So the recruiter has stored the meeting duration in this cell, and you can see that this is a named item by the name of meeting duration. So in this particular cell, there's the actual value. So we want to compute the finish time based on the start time, and then the minutes as configured by the recruiter. So those are some of the business rules that we want to apply to this, and then we can return the kind of the filtered array out of what this is doing. So right now this is returning um, all 3 records, but what we want is like per interviewer collection. So which means we want 1 record per the interview. So going back to the structure that I showed originally, so this is sort of our goal out of this script, which is create 1 record per invitation. So this will contain the candidate and the single interviewer and then the start and finish time. So that way we can feed this if we can feed this data into Teams action and then have Teams send invitation 1 per record. So obviously the single row here contains 2 interviewers, so we will want to break this up into 2 separate records. Okay, so that's sort of the set of business rules that we want to apply. So the helper function we wrote gives a list of objects, but we can take that and transform that further by applying these rules that I mentioned. So maybe as a first step, I can retrieve the meeting duration. There are several ways to do it. You can obviously go to the sheet and get the B1 reference. But given that this is already in a named item, so there is a simpler way to do that. So I'm going to do that by extracting that into, let's call it meeting duration. And so workbook offers get named item as a method. And the key is the name of the named item. So it's that. And then I will get the underlying range object associated with it, and range offers the value function. So now the meeting duration here contains the actual value. So if you want to just confirm, you can just do console log meeting duration, and we can just run this and make sure it displays 45 here. I want to get a single value, not the values. So now, okay, so I'm getting the actual meeting duration. And the next step is to perform this next set of business rules, which is to apply condition for the interview invite to interview as not sent. To do that, I'm going to go through each of the records and then and filter out those rows for whom the invitation have already been sent. So I'm going to call selected rows. So a true here would mean that invitations for both have been sent, or so it has been processed. So with that assumption, so I'm going to go through sorry. So I'm going to filter the data rows first. And for this, I'm going to get a row and the index that it is on. And in this callback function, I'm going to get, I'm just returning if the row one. So this is the 0th column, this is the first column. So which means I want this to be false. And I also want the first row because I need the keys to be extracted. So I also want the first row. So I'll say if I is 0, that means if it's a header row or any row on which the this value is false. So I want to extract those records. Now the Now from the selected rows, I'm going to use, instead of using all the rows, now I'm going to use the selected rows. And so as you can see, there is one row for whom the invitation has already been sent. So I should now get just 2 records. As you can see, it is only extracting records where the invitation to interview has not been sent. So these are the 2 records. The one with the column marked as true is now not being extracted. The next thing I want to do is now for each of the rows, I want to extract the individual invitation objects, which means something that I can directly pass it on to the team. To do that, I will need to generate the interview records out of this object structure. So I'm going to start out by writing another helper function to achieve that. So let's call this function generate interview records. So this receives basically the object structure that we were able to extract. and then it is going to return an array of uh, interview objects that has one interviewer and one candidate combination with start and finish time. So to do that, I will need additional interface definition. So what this allows me to do is declare the structure that I will need. So the first is the input record that matches the table data. So this is pretty much what we are displaying here. So that means for each of the keys in this interface, I have key value pair definition. And then what we want out of this function is to generate just the actual invite record, which has the exact set of information that is needed in the create meeting action. So this is the kind of the output object that we want to send. A collection or an array of this record is what we want to send out of the new function we're going to create. So I'll begin by saying, hey, this is the interview. I want this to return an interview invite. And then we can say, hey, it's going to receive a collection of records that matches the input information of the table. And now it's going to extract and send out a collection of interview invites, which is just the set of information that is needed, which has unique candidate and interviewer combination. So as you can see, it expects the record detail to be received. So we can now override the information that's being returned out of the first function that we wrote. So instead of sending basic object, now we can say this is going to return record detail by overriding it this way. So what we did was we went back to the return object from values function, and then instead of returning the basic object, uh, we overrode that saying, hey, it's actually returning the record details. The reason why we're doing is because in the next function we are writing, we want to access the individual properties, because we want to be able to apply further rules, which is to extract the start date and time information. And overriding with the actual interface allows us to do code completion and get the exact property that we are interested in. So in this function, what we want to do now is to extract the interview invitation records. So I'm going to declare interview invites as the output that we want to send. So it requires us to go through each of the records that we receive here. So I'm going to do a for each loop, and for each of the record we're going to apply some rules. So the first is to look at the interviewer one record. So that is extract information pertaining to interviewer one. So the next business rule is that we should only select records whose date and time specified here is in the future. Now the key thing to call out here is you'll see that this is in a standard ISO date template. and the structure, which means that it has the um, the time zone encoded directly in here. And the reason why we need this is because the Power Automation, when it runs, it assumes that any date present here is the sort of the GMT time. If we want to extract time or compute time, we want to make sure that we are always encoding that with the correct time zone, so that the date computation occurs consistently across both while I'm testing here within Excel and also while I'm running in Power Automation. A downside to that is that I cannot format this as one of the date formats because it simply won't adhere to the same template. So I'm going to just treat this as a text. Assume that the process that inputting values, the time and date time, has enough checks and balances in place to ensure that the correct time and time format is being used to record the information. So with that assumption, I'm going to start checking if this date is in the future. So to do that, I'll get a new date JavaScript date object for the interviewer one start time. So I could do that by start time one. So that is the key, as you can see here. Start time one is the key. So that's the date that I'm looking for. So what I want to do is now I want to check if this date, the new date that I extracted out of that, is greater than the current date. And if that is the case, I'm going to extract all the individual properties that I need. First, I need the start time. So I'm going to extract this into the ISO string format because that is one of the format that the Teams action will accept, and it will encode the date with the correct formatting information so that the next step that consumes this will treat the time zone correctly. So for the time being, I'm just gonna put the start and finish time to be the same. Obviously, we'll have to come back and compute the finish time by adding the duration. So for the time being, I'm just going to use that as is. And then to the output array, I'm going to just add this record. Right? So to do that, I will need to add that in the format of the interview invites. So which means for each of the records here, I will need to assign the values. I'm going to extract the corresponding values from the record object. You'll notice that the code completion only works for keys that have a single word. So for things like candidate email or candidate contact. Because there is a space in it, it will not autocomplete. So we'll have to type that up manually. So this is interviewer one, so I'm going to extract interviewer one information. Okay, so this will push all the information pertaining to the first interviewer, given the start time is in the future with this condition. So I just need to repeat this for the second interviewer. So I'm going to just basically copy paste this for the second interviewer. I'm going to just select second instance of this. So wherever there's interviewer one, I'm going to make it interviewer two, and same thing for start time. We'll come back and fix the finish time. So same thing, so I'll have to push the values into the output array, and now I'm ready to return this array object. So I can just return yep, I'm already doing that. So let me just log what's being returned, just so I can make sure that it is doing the right thing. Maybe it was already done here. Now I have to call that function. And call it invite records. And I'm going to call this with the record details. Going to display what's being returned out of the next function. I'm going to save it and run it. So what I expect now is to for the next function to have selected a separate record for each of the candidate and interviewer one combination, with the condition of the start time being in the future being met. I had to pause the video to check why it wasn't returning. So it turned out the dates that I had were all in the past. So I updated some of these dates to point to the future dates. So as you can see, compared to the current time, these three records are in the future. So this one is in the past. The middle record, anyway, is not going to be selected because it's marked as already sent. And so with that, I expect 1, 2, and 3 records to be coming out of the function that we just wrote. So we see that 2 rows are being sent, And because each row has two interviewers and one of the interviewer doesn't pass the check because of the time validation, so the other three records. Now the structure pretty much matches with what we had in mind in terms of the output. And you'll see that the start and finish time obviously have the same values because we assigned the same value. We now need to compute the finish time by adding minutes to the start time. And this is the ISO format, and this is sort of ideal for sending to the Teams action to have the time appropriately matched to the correct time zone. So now what we're going to do is for the same generate interview records, we're going to add the we're going to pass the actual minutes, and for instead of finish time being assigned to the start time, we're going to compute and add 45 minutes to it. So first we'll receive okay, so now that we have the meeting duration, so we now need to compute the minutes that we obtained from here to the start time. So to do that, we'll write like another helper function which accepts the minutes and then the date and then returns the new date. So we're going to call this function add minutes. It is going to accept a start time as date and then the minutes, and it is going to return a new date object by adding the number of minutes. So this is the way to do that. So I'll get the time and compute the milliseconds and add that to the time, and then it will simply return that. And now what we're going to do is use that. We're going to call this or at the point where we are assigning the finish time. So instead of this, we're going to call the function that we just wrote, and we're going to send the start time to that, and meeting duration as a second object. We'll do the same thing for the finish time. So now when I run this, I should have 45 minutes added to each of the start time. So I'll see that, okay, this is 22 and 22:45. This is 17, 17:45, and then it matches. So if I go back and maybe change this to 50 minutes, it should dynamically update to the 58 minutes. So this allows you to maintain kind of configurable data in a separate sheet and have that fed into the script directly. All right, so now that we have this, so we are ready to return the data out of here. And to do that, we're going to just declare that, hey, from here, we're going to return the invitation record. So that is, we know that invitation record is our interface type interview invite. So if we declare that I'm returning a collection of interview invites, so this completes the first script. So what this is doing is it's coming in and going through all of the records, selecting the eligible rows, and returning an array of collection of an array of objects that can then be fed into the team's meeting invite action. Okay, so the next thing I could do is kind of go to Power Automation and put together the flow. So I'll go to my flow and create a new instant flow in this case. So I'll manually trigger this. I'll call this Teams meeting invites. So I'll select Excel Online, run script. I want to pick the location of the Excel file. So this happens to be in my OneDrive for Business. And the file was called HR schedule. That is in a folder called demo. Okay. And the script I want to run is meeting schedule. The next thing I want to do is use the Teams create Teams meeting. Let's say interview. I'll pick the candidate name. Now the minute I select one of the values, it immediately understood that hey, there's one per record, so it created the apply action. So in the message, I'll say, please say hello, interviewer. Please conduct interview candidate name, contact information is, I'm going to list the candidate phone number as well as the candidate email. So for the start time, I'm going to pick the start time from the record. For the end time, I'm going to pick the finish time. For the attendees, I'm going to pick two emails separated by a semicolon, so which means the same Teams meeting is going to be sent to both the interviewer and the candidate. So that's pretty much it, and we'll compare to what we originally saw. All right, so this is what we saw originally as our target. So we're not there yet with respect to the last action, but we are almost there. So now what this is doing is this is going to go through each of the rows. It's going to select the candidates and the interviewers and computes the start and end time. And then it's going to send separate calendar invites for each one of them. So the last step that is required is to, once the invitations have been sent, once the meetings have been created, we want to come back and mark these to be true. So that way, the next time it runs, we won't duplicate the team meetings. To do that, we will need to run a second Office script. We cannot use the same Office script because this is the one that's extracting, and we need to wait for the team's invitation to be sent. And as a next step, we want to run the last script, which goes back and updates the records. So we'll go back quickly to automate again and create a new script. We'll call this mark as complete, or say mark as invited. So you will notice that the output information that we're sending from the first script and then into the teams action is going to look something like this. So where we have the unique object for each of the candidate and the interviewer. We can come back and match the ID, which means if the ID matches, we know that a Teams meeting has been created, and then we can mark that to be true. So it may be the case that we may have sort of two objects for the same ID, but that is okay. It may end up updating it twice, but no harm done. So to keep the logic simple, we're just gonna go through one of these, each of these rows and match the ID. And if the ID matches, we're gonna come back and update the invite. So to do that, I will kind of quickly go back and copy sort of the same information that we need, because we need the same table information. So now that I have the table, I'm going to extract the underlying range object. So I'll say const range is table.getRange. And now what we want to do is go through one row at a time and compare to what was being, compared to the records that was used to send the Teams meeting. So obviously it needs an input. So we'll say invite invites, and Office script can receive parameters, but the catch is it can only be strings. So we'll say this is a string. So these are the invite records that we send to Teams action, and then we're going to receive that back as a string, and we're going to process that in a second. So then we will need the same interface that was used for the interviews to create the interview invites. So we will get the invites as, let's say, JSON parsed. So what this line is saying is that, hey, parse this string input, and I'm casting that as an array of interview invites. So now I can iterate over this and extract individual pieces of information using using the keys. So first, I'm going to go through each rows and look for the IDs where it matches with the interview invite IDs. So for that, I'm going to do a simple for loop. So I'll extract the values out of this range. So that's in rows. So for each of the rows, I'm going to traverse through each of those. And then I'll say, hey, if the I know that this is the first column, so this is going to be 0. So that means if the first column happens to be equal to, well, I need a second loop. So now for each of the, let's say for let invite of invites, so I'm inside the second loop. So inside the second loop, now I want to compare for each of the invites dot id, and then because this is of type string, I'm gonna convert this into a string. Otherwise, it'll come out as a number, and the numbers will not match. The types will not match. So what this is saying is, hey, for each of the, so go through each of the rows, and for each row, compare with all the records that were sent from the earlier script. And if you find a match for the ID, now we have to mark this second column to be true. So to do that, I will have to now extract the column. So to do that, I'll go back to the original range, and there's a function called getCell. So this gives me the actual cell. I have to supply both the row and the column. The row is I, and then the column is 1. So I'm hard coding it. So you can um, you can use other techniques like getting the actual column by name, and then going back to the index, but knowing that there is nothing else happening in between the flow, this is quite safe to do. So now I'm going to set its value to be true, right? So this should pretty much achieve what I want to do. So now to test this, it's a bit tricky because you want to simulate what comes out of the actual flow. One kind of quick and easy way to do this is to go back to the source, which is returning the objects, and instead of printing the records, so when I run this, it's gonna print the actual objects, right? So instead, I can now print its JSON representation. So there's a function called JSON stringify. I can use that and then copy that over to the next function. So this is the actual string that is going to be passed in the Power Automation when we add the next step. So I can pass this to, for during testing, I can just say I can override that. I'll have to remember to comment that out later, right? So so this is what gets passed to the script, and for each of the ID, so it has 1, 2, and 3. You'll see that the 30 is repeating. That's okay. So when I run this, I expect both these records to be updated. All right, so let's run this. So you'll see that this was updated. I'll change it back. So now let's say I make this 50 just to test. So this should not be updated. It should only update the first row. That happens. So I'm pretty confident that this is working, and I'll go back and fix this back and comment this out, knowing that Power Automation is gonna send the same data here, in a dynamic fashion. I'm gonna go back to my Power Automation, create a run script action, and I'm gonna repeat the same thing, but this time call a different office script. So this is the last script you want to run, and um, you see that the invite as string was dynamically added here because it knows that this is a parameter it expects. So for this, I'm gonna kind of go back and look at how this is being handled here. So that's a result. So I'll look for dynamic content called result. So essentially the same output coming out of the first run script is going to be fed into the Teams meeting action as well as the next script action. So now I'm going to run this. I'm going to save this. So this is sort of the overall end-to-end flow that we need. So now I can save and test this. So I'll go back and make sure I have, so I expect 3 records coming out of here, and then the Teams meeting to be sent for those 3 records, and then the data should be marked as true as invitation being sent. So I'm going to test this manually. Okay, so now the flow is running. I can go back and check for the results here. We'll just wait for that to complete. Okay, so let's go back and check. So you'll see that it has sent 3 invites. So we can see that. And then the next thing is that it sent the same information back through the script, 3 records. So let's go back here and then first double check, make sure. I'm going to refresh the spreadsheet. So you see that these records are marked as sent, invitations are sent, and we can come back and check here to see if these users, so the first invitation was sent to Megan, the next invitation was sent to Nestor, and then to Raul. So if I check, so I see that Megan, Nestor, and Raul, because those are the records that qualified. Patty here did not qualify because the date happens to be, at the time that I'm testing is, so this happened to be this didn't match the date check. Okay, so that kind of concludes the demo. And so what I showcased is the end-to-end flow that you can use to achieve a simple scheduling automation using Office scripts and Power Automate. All the source code, all the input files that I've used are going to be made available. Just check out the description link below and you will see all the source code. If you have any questions, do leave a comment and I'm going to be happy to address any questions you may have. Right, thank you.